The tank is one of the most important parts of a motorcycle, since it carries the fuel that allows us to ride our bikes. But have you ever stopped to think how this essential component is manufactured? How are such perfect tanks made? What machines are involved in the manufacturing process? Fuel tanks can be manufactured in two ways, either by stamping or by using the casting method. The casting process is used for smaller motorcycles like scooters, while the stamping method is mostly used for bigger bikes. Let's start with the stamping method. Stamping is basically the same as the process used to manufacture car body panels, which involves pressing a sheet metal between two dies to form a part. In this case, the piece will become the outer shell of the motorcycle's tank. However, unlike cars, where only one piece is created at a time, the tank production line can produce 6 pieces simultaneously. The first step in the stamping process is loading the blanks into the press machine. The blanks are essentially large sheets of steel, aluminum, or plastic, depending on the type of motorcycle tank being produced. This big steel blank has already been cut to size, leaving a little extra material around the edges to be trimmed later on. A lubrication system then applies a thin layer of oil to the blank to prevent the metal from sticking to the die. Once everything is in place, the press machine closes its two halves, the upper punch and the lower die, and presses the blank, forming the outer shell of the fuel tank. Once the press machine opens, robots grab the newly formed shell and transfer it to the next production station. At this point, the raw shell looks more like a bucket than a motorcycle gas tank. To fix that, another machine, called a trim press, removes the excess material from the edges of the shell. You might also notice that the edges of the shell are turned up at an angle. This is done so that the pieces can be joined together correctly later on. Next, the shells go through a series of quality control checks to ensure they meet the required standards. Any defective pieces are removed from the line and sent for reworking. The good pieces move on to the next station, where robots weld the pieces together along the edges that were turned up earlier. After welding, the edges are sanded smooth, and the tank is given a protective coating to prevent corrosion. Now it's time to turn the shells into actual fuel tanks. For this, the tanks are taken to another area where robots install the various components, including the gas cap, filler neck, and petcock. These components are installed using After the tanks are filled with the necessary components, they are tested to ensure they are leak-proof and road-ready. Finally, they are loaded onto trucks and shipped to the assembly plant, where they will be installed on the motorcycles. Now let's see how motorcycle fuel tanks are made by using the casting method. Although this method is used for smaller bikes, the process is similar to what is used in the automotive industry to cast larger components like cylinder heads and engine blocks. The first step in the casting process is to create a mold. The mold is basically a hollow container that will hold the molten metal as it cools and solidifies into the shape of the final part. In this case, the mold is made of two halves that are clamped together to form a watertight seal. Next, the mold is coated with a lubricant to prevent the metal from sticking to it. Then the molten metal, which in this case is aluminum, is poured into the top of the mold. Once the metal has filled the mold, it is allowed to cool and solidify. After the metal has hardened, the mold is opened and the newly formed tank is removed. At this point, the tank will look rough and unfinished, so it goes to a machine called a shakeout machine to remove any excess metal or slag. Next, the tank is cleaned and inspected to ensure it meets the required standards. Any defective tanks are reworked, while the good ones move on to the next station where they receive their finishing touches. This may include trimming any loose edges, smoothing out any rough spots, and drilling any necessary holes. Finally, the tanks are coated with a protective finish, such as paint or powder coating, and they are ready to be installed on the motorcycles. Motorcycle fuel tanks come in different shapes and sizes, depending on the model of bike they are made for. Some are round, while others are more angular. Some are large and hold several gallons of fuel, while others are small and can hold only a few liters. However, no matter what their shape or size, all motorcycle fuel tanks perform the same function. They store and transport fuel from the fuel pump to the engine. Motorcycle fuel tanks are typically made from steel or aluminum. Steel is the cheaper option, but it is heavier and more susceptible to rust. Aluminum is lighter and more resistant to corrosion, but it is also more expensive. Regardless of the material used, all motorcycle fuel tanks must be strong enough to withstand the pressure of the fuel and the forces generated by the engine. Designing a motorcycle fuel tank is a complex process that involves a lot of factors. Engineers must take into account the bike's performance, weight, and handling when designing the tank. They must also ensure that the tank is strong enough to withstand the rigors of riding a motorcycle. In recent years, some motorcycle manufacturers have begun experimenting with plastic fuel tanks. Plastic tanks are lighter than steel or aluminum tanks, and they are also less prone to corrosion. However, plastic tanks are not as strong as metal tanks, so they are only used on smaller bikes. The price of a motorcycle fuel tank varies depending on the make and model of the bike. A simple steel tank for a small bike could cost a few $100s, while a more complex aluminum tank for a larger bike could cost several $1,000s. If you want to replace your motorcycle fuel tank, you can do it yourself, but it is a challenging job. You need to drain the old tank and remove it from the bike. Then you need to install the new tank and reconnect all the hoses and wires. If you are not comfortable working on your bike, you should take it to a qualified mechanic. There are many different types of fuel tanks used on motorcycles, but the most common are the steel tanks, aluminum tanks, and plastic tanks. Steel tanks are the most affordable option, but they are also the heaviest. Aluminum tanks are lighter and more resistant to corrosion, while plastic tanks are the lightest, but not as strong. The average lifespan of a motorcycle fuel tank is about 10 years. However, this can vary depending on the make and model of the bike. As well, with proper care, you can expect your motorcycle fuel tank to last for many years. So that was it for today's video. We hope you liked our content. Do comment down below what you think about the manufacturing process of a motorcycle fuel tank. And if you really want to know how motorcycles work, subscribe for more videos. We'll catch you guys in the next one. Till then, keep the throttle pinned.